He was a Navy SEAL once, a man trained to survive everything except peace. Now, he spends his days under gray skies, repairing an old bridge that no one else cares to notice. The rain had been falling all afternoon when his dog, Thor, began barking at the river below.
What is it, Thor?
Jack wiped his hands, leaned over the railing, and saw a large black bag spinning in the current, snagged on a beam. Something about it felt wrong, too heavy, too alive. He jumped, and when he cut it open on the shore, a woman gasped for air, eyes wide, terrified. Then she whispered, "Are you Jack Porter?" Jack froze. How could a stranger know his name, and why did she look at him like she'd seen him before? Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and second chances. The rain had been falling since dawn, turning the Oregon sky into a curtain of gray and the river beneath the bridge into a writhing, mud-colored serpent. Jack Porter wiped the mist from his face with the back of his hand, his breath fogging in the cold air. At 45, the years had hardened him in quiet ways. Lines around the eyes, a heaviness in his shoulders, a stillness that spoke of wars long past. His beard was short, streaked with gray, his hands rough from labor rather than battle now. The world knew him as a bridge worker, but once, long ago, he had been a Navy SEAL, the kind of man who could disappear into the desert and come back with ghosts in his eyes. Those ghosts still followed him. They always did. Beside him, a large German shepherd named Thor paced along the damp boards, his black and tan coat glistening under the drizzle. Thor was 6, trained once for service but never deployed. A rescue like Jack himself. The two shared a silence that was not empty but understood, the kind that only broken men and loyal dogs could share. Then Thor froze, his ears twitching toward the river. A deep growl rumbled in his chest before he barked, sharp, desperate, commanding. Jack straightened, frowning, and followed the dog's line of sight. Below the bridge, something pale bobbed in the current, a plastic bag tangled around a shape that wasn't quite still. Without hesitation, Jack dropped his wrench and ran. He moved with the instinct of someone who had done this before, reacting before thinking, diving before fear could catch up. The water was ice, slicing through his muscles like blades, but he fought the current, one arm cutting, one reaching. The bag tore beneath his fingers, revealing a woman's face, waxen, lips blue, eyes half open. He hauled her to the embankment, coughing hard, dragging her body clear of the tide. For a moment, he thought she was gone. Then, a faint shudder, the smallest gasp. Jack tilted her head back, sealed his lips over hers, and breathed life into the cold shell beneath him. Once, twice, again, until her chest lifted on its own. She coughed water, her whole body convulsing. Her skin was ashen under the rain, long hair clinging to her cheeks in dark ropes. She was maybe 30, thin but strong-looking, with the kind of beauty that came from endurance rather than softness. When her eyes opened, they were green, wild, frightened, searching. She stared at him as if recognizing a memory that shouldn't exist. Her voice trembled. "Are you Jack Porter?" He blinked. "You know me? I saw your photo on my sister's wall." She shivered, teeth chattering, tears mingling with the rain. "They're following me. Please, save me." Jack's stomach tightened. The way she said they wasn't the sound of paranoia. It was the sound of someone who had run too long. He wanted to ask more, but the distant wail of sirens cut through the storm. Red and blue lights flickered across the fog. Thor barked once, pacing at Jack's side as the first responders arrived. 2 police cruisers, followed by a black SUV that didn't belong. From the SUV stepped Lucas Hart, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who wore a suit like armor. His hair was dark, combed with precision, his jaw clean-shaven, his expression controlled. But Jack froze, the tilt of that head, the sharpness of those gray eyes. It was impossible. Lucas Hart was the name on the side of the SUV, the emblem of Harper Davent's Logistics, a private security empire. But Jack didn't see Lucas. He saw Eli Harper, the man who once stood beside him in the sands of Yemen, the man who had died in the explosion that killed the rest of their team. Eli had been the calm in chaos, the one who cracked jokes over gunfire, the brother Jack had buried in his mind a decade ago. Eli's gaze met his, unreadable but aware. For a moment, the storm around them fell away, replaced by the silent roar of memory, the smell of diesel, the flash of fire, the sound of a voice yelling, "Go, Jack, get out!" And then nothing. Now, here he was, alive, wearing another man's name, standing beside local police who didn't seem to notice the tension thickening between them. The officers lifted the woman, Claire Dawson, she murmured when asked her name, onto a stretcher. Her fingers clutched Jack's sleeve as they carried her past. Her grip was surprisingly strong, knuckles white against the soaked fabric. She whispered through trembling lips, "Don't let them take me." The rain swallowed her voice, but Jack heard every syllable. One of the officers, a young man with freckles and a polite distance in his tone, thanked Jack for his heroic action. Jack nodded absently. His focus stayed on Eli, Lucas, whoever he was. The man's posture was calm, professional, but the eyes betrayed something colder. Not shock, not gratitude, recognition. As the vehicles pulled away, Thor whined softly. Jack stood alone on the slick pavement, water running down his face, but the cold wasn't from the rain. Something in his gut had turned to stone. He'd spent years trying to forget the past, burying it under the noise of drills, steel, and routine. But tonight it had clawed its way back to the surface, in the face of a stranger who knew his name and the eyes of a ghost who shouldn't exist. When the last siren faded, the world was quiet again. Just the hiss of rain and the creak of the bridge above the river. Jack knelt beside Thor, running a trembling hand through the dog's wet fur. The animal pressed close, steady, anchoring him to the present. Jack looked out at the water, where moments ago a life had drifted between death and rescue, and whispered under his breath, "What the hell are you into, Claire Dawson?" But the river gave no answer, only the wind carrying the echo of her voice. "Please, don't let them take me," blending with the relentless rain like a promise he didn't know he'd already made. The rain had slowed to a mist by the time Jack Porter reached his small rented house on the edge of Astoria. The structure leaned slightly with age, its wood swollen from years of coastal damp. He left his jacket hanging by the door, the smell of salt and iron following him inside. Thor padded across the creaking floorboards, his claws ticking softly. The dog settled by the stove, where a single ember still glowed in the ashes. Jack filled a pot with water, not because he was thirsty, but because he needed the sound of something other than silence. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wall where an old photograph hung. 6 men in desert fatigues, smiling beneath the glare of a sun that could burn through bone. They had been brothers once. In the middle stood Eli Harper, clean-cut, grinning, one hand resting on Jack's shoulder. His name was carved into the memorial stone in Arlington now, yet Jack had seen him today, alive, shaking hands with law enforcement under a new name, Lucas Hart. Jack's reflection stared back at him in the window, the same face, older, hollowed by years of regret. He had survived Yemen when no one else had. It wasn't heroism, it was chance, a last-minute change in formation. The blast had taken everyone ahead of him. The report had said insurgent ambush, but something had always felt wrong, too precise, too coordinated. And Eli, the team's communications officer, had been the one to radio their position minutes before the explosion. He remembered the static, the single unfinished word, coordinates. Then fire. Jack's fists tightened around his coffee mug until it cracked. Thor lifted his head at the sound, tail thumping once as if reminding his owner to breathe. Jack sighed, rubbing his temple. "He's alive, buddy," he murmured. "Eli's alive." Saying it aloud made the world tilt. The rain against the window softened to a whisper. Jack opened his old laptop, scratched, dented, half the keyboard polished smooth from years of use. His internet connection crawled, but he wasn't looking for speed. He typed Lucas Hart, Harper Defense Logistics, and pressed enter. A flood of articles appeared. Hart was described as a visionary CEO, a defense contractor supplying security teams across Africa and Eastern Europe. The company had government contracts, black budgets, and no shortage of secrecy. Jack scrolled through photos. Lucas shaking hands with senators, attending charity galas, standing beside soldiers in desert bases. His hair was shorter now, his face harder, but the eyes were the same. They had seen the same horrors. Only one of them had profited from them. A particular image caught his breath. Lucas beside a woman in a navy blazer, smiling for a press photo. Beneath it, the caption, Claire Dawson, freelance journalist, consulting on defense transparency initiatives. Jack's blood turned cold. Claire Dawson, the woman he had pulled from the river. Coincidence was too sharp to be coincidence. He leaned back in his chair, the old wood groaning under his weight, mind racing. What was she investigating? What had she found that made her end up in a plastic bag beneath his bridge? His phone buzzed on the counter, a local news alert. Woman rescued from river under police protection. Jack clicked the link. The image was blurry but unmistakable. Claire in a hospital gown, oxygen tube over her face, eyes half open. The article mentioned that she was under supervision at St. Helena Medical Center and expected to recover. But the phrasing made Jack's neck prickle. Under supervision, not under care. There was no statement from the police, only one from a Harper Defense spokesperson thanking the first responders for their timely assistance. Jack closed the laptop and rubbed his forehead. He could still see Eli's face in the rain, calm, detached, as if the world moved to a rhythm only he could hear. He remembered that same look once, in Yemen, right before the explosion. The same composure, the same faint smile. It wasn't the look of a soldier. It was the look of a man who already knew what would happen. He stood, pacing. His limp, almost invisible to others, flared up when he was angry. An old shrapnel wound in his thigh, his reminder that survival wasn't free. Thor followed him from room to room, watching silently. Jack stopped at the small desk near the window, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old steel lockbox. Inside lay a pistol wrapped in a cloth, a handful of medals, and a folded letter from the Navy that began with the words, "We regret to inform you." He traced the edge of the paper. That letter had been for Eli's family, a family who had buried an empty casket. A knock startled him. Thor rose, hackles bristling. Jack moved quietly to the door, opening it just enough to see a young mail carrier holding a manila envelope, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. "Delivery for Mr. Porter," the man said. Jack signed, shut the door, and turned the envelope over. No return address. Inside was a photograph, recent, printed on glossy paper. It showed Claire in a hospital bed, asleep. In the corner of the photo, written in black ink, "You can't save her twice." Jack stared at it, pulse hammering in his ears. The message was a taunt, not a warning. He tossed the envelope into the stove, watching the flame devour the image until it curled to ash. Whoever sent it wanted him to stay away. That alone was reason enough to do the opposite. He turned to Thor. "Get in the truck." The dog's ears perked, tail stiffening with alert readiness. The truck was old, an F-150 from another lifetime, patched with duct tape and hope. The rain began again as they rolled onto the coastal highway. Jack drove without the radio on, only the rhythmic squeak of wipers marking time. The hospital sat 20 miles inland, a sterile block of glass and steel, surrounded by pine woods. The last time he'd entered one, it was to watch a comrade die. The drive gave him time to think, though thinking brought no peace. Why had Eli, Lucas, let himself be seen? If the man had wanted to stay hidden, he could have. Maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was a message. Jack replayed every detail of that encounter under the bridge. The black SUV, the men in suits, the way Claire's voice broke when she said, "They're following me." She hadn't meant random criminals. She had meant them. Harper's men. By the time the hospital's lights came into view, Jack's decision was set. He parked 2 blocks away, engine idling, and looked at Thor. The dog's eyes met his, calm and trusting, the same expression he'd worn in the desert when the world went to hell. Jack smiled grimly. Just like old times. He pulled his jacket tight, checked the pistol at his side, and stepped out into the rain. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. when Jack Porter parked his truck 2 blocks from St. Helena Medical Center. The rain had turned into a fine drizzle, silvering the asphalt under the streetlights. The hospital stood ahead, tall and sterile, its windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. Jack sat for a moment, fingers drumming the steering wheel, the rhythm matching his pulse. Thor waited beside him, his dark fur damp, his eyes alert. The German shepherd gave a low, questioning whine as if to ask, "Are we doing this again, old man?" Jack managed a dry smile. "Yeah, buddy," he murmured, loading a single clip into his pistol. "We're doing this again." He moved through the parking lot's shadows, the smell of disinfectant and wet pine heavy in the air. The front entrance was too visible, too exposed. Two men stood near the main doors, tall, broad, in identical black suits. Their posture gave them away. No police officer stood that still. Their shoes were polished, their earpieces discreet, and when one turned slightly, Jack caught a glimpse of the Harper defense emblem, a falcon's talon clutching the world, embossed in gold on a lapel pin. Private security, not law enforcement, the kind Eli used overseas. Jack crouched behind a parked ambulance, scanning the building's side until he found what he needed, a fire escape and an unguarded maintenance door. Inside, the hospital smelled of bleach and sleep. The corridors were dim, save for the bluish light of exit signs. Jack moved like a shadow, his limp faint but constant. He'd learned to hide pain long ago. It was just another kind of camouflage. Thor followed soundlessly, every step precise, ears pricked. The dog's training never left him. He stopped when Jack stopped, advanced only when signaled. Together, they reached the stairwell and climbed floor by floor until the muffled sound of voices filtered through the crack of a door. A nurse sat at the reception desk of the third floor, scrolling through her phone. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with chestnut hair tied in a bun and tired circles under her eyes. Her name tag read M. Heller. She didn't look dangerous, just exhausted. Jack stepped out of the stairwell and approached her calmly. "Evening," he said, voice steady but low. "I'm here to see Claire Dawson. She's under police watch." The nurse blinked, startled by his sudden appearance. "Visiting hours are over," she stammered. "You can't—" He leaned closer, eyes sharp. "I'm her brother. They didn't have time to list me." It wasn't the best lie, but it was fast. Her hesitation lasted 3 seconds, long enough. He slid a folded $100 bill across the counter. She bit her lip, glanced toward the hallway, then nodded toward room 314. "Make it quick." Jack gave a grateful nod, then disappeared down the corridor, with Thor padding behind him. The door to room 314 was half open, light, spilling into the hall. Inside, Claire lay propped against a pillow, pale but awake. Her hair was damp, and her wrists bore faint marks from rope burns. The room was quiet, except for the steady beep of a heart monitor. When she saw Jack, her eyes widened with disbelief and relief all at once. "You came," she whispered. He closed the door, gently, motioning for silence. "I had a feeling they weren't keeping you safe," he said. Up close, she looked worse. Dark circles, trembling hands, the faint smell of saline and fear. "You were right," she murmured. "They're not police. They're his men." "Eli's?" Jack asked. She nodded. "He calls himself Lucas now, but it's him." Her voice cracked. "He knows I found the files. He'll come for me before morning." She winced as she reached for the bedside table, pulling out a scrap of paper and a pen. Her fingers shook as she wrote, each stroke deliberate. "The original drive," she whispered. "I hid it. Cabin near Silver Creek. Under the floor." Jack frowned. "What's on it?" Claire met his gaze, her green eyes fierce despite her weakness. "Proof. The contracts, payments, the coordinates from Yemen. He sold your team's position, Jack, for money." The words hit like a bullet. Jack's jaw tightened, but there was no time to absorb it. The lights flickered once, twice, then went dark. The heart monitor beeped erratically before falling silent. The hallway outside echoed with the heavy sound of boots. Thor growled low, muscles coiling. Claire gripped Jack's arm. "They're here," she whispered. Jack moved fast, disconnecting her IV with one hand while pulling his pistol from the holster with the other. "Can you walk?" She nodded, teeth clenched. He opened the door a crack. The corridor was dim, only emergency lights glowing red. Two silhouettes advanced from the far end, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Back," Jack whispered. He guided Claire toward the emergency exit. Thor slipped ahead, ears twitching, reading the air. A crash echoed. The men had reached the nurse's station. One barked orders into a radio. Jack took the stairwell, moving down fast, supporting Claire as she stumbled. The metallic clatter of boots followed. "Faster," he hissed. Thor bolted ahead, nose close to the floor, leading them through a service corridor that smelled of antiseptic and oil. They burst through a rear door into the rain-soaked loading area. One of the gunmen appeared behind them, shouting. Jack fired once, aiming low. The man dropped, cursing. The other returned fire, bullets ricocheting off the metal railing. Thor lunged, grabbing the attacker's arm, dragging him down before he could reload. Jack hauled Claire toward the parking lot, rain blinding them. The sound of sirens rose in the distance, real ones this time. He shoved her into the passenger seat of the truck, Thor leaping into the back. Tires screeched as he pulled away from the curb, the hospital shrinking in the rearview mirror, its lights flickering in the storm. Claire pressed her hand to her chest, trying to breathe. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly. "You'd be dead if I hadn't," Jack replied. Thor whined, shaking water from his coat. The wipers beat furiously against the glass, pushing the night aside just enough for Jack to see the road ahead. Winding, dark, full of questions that had waited 10 years to be answered. The rain had followed them all the way north, chasing the truck through winding forest roads until the asphalt gave way to mud. The headlights cut through the mist, carving ghostly tunnels through the pine trees that loomed over Silver Creek. The air smelled of sap and wet earth. Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. He hadn't spoken in an hour, and the silence in the cab had grown heavier than the storm outside. Claire sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket he'd found under the seat. Her hair clung to her face, damp and tangled, her gaze fixed on the road ahead as though afraid it might disappear. Thor lay across the back seat, eyes half open but alert, his breathing steady. The German shepherd's fur was still matted from the rain, yet he looked ready to leap into battle if his master so much as flinched. Jack slowed as the dirt path narrowed, the sound of the creek rising over the hum of the engine. He turned into a clearing where a small cabin crouched between two towering pines. The place looked abandoned, its roof sagged under years of moss, and the porch railing leaned like a tired man. "This is it," Claire whispered, her voice fragile but sure. Jack killed the engine and listened. No other vehicles, no movement, only the drip of rain and the wind moving through the trees like a warning. He stepped out first, flashlight in hand, and motioned for Thor to follow. The dog sniffed the air, tail stiff, before trotting ahead toward the porch. Claire hesitated at the door, pressing her palm to the damp wood. "I came here a week ago," she murmured. "I didn't think I'd ever come back." Her hand trembled as she pushed it open. The interior smelled of dust and rot, the faint sweetness of decay. A single table stood near the fireplace, covered with old papers and the remnants of a coffee mug left long ago. Jack swept the room with his flashlight, his instincts humming. "You sure this is safe?" he asked. Claire managed a thin smile. "Safe doesn't really exist anymore, does it?" She knelt beside the wooden floorboards and began feeling along the seams. Her movements were practiced, desperate yet deliberate, as though she had rehearsed this moment in her mind every day since she fled. "Under here," she said, tapping a narrow board. Jack crouched beside her and pried it up with the butt of his knife. Beneath it, wrapped in layers of plastic, was a small metal case no bigger than a lunchbox. Claire's breath caught. "It's still here." Jack lifted the box onto the table. It was scratched and dented, sealed with electrical tape. He pulled a screwdriver from his pocket and peeled it open. Inside lay a single solid-state drive encased in foam. Next to it, a small digital recorder. Claire's hands shook as she turned it on. The voice that came through the static froze the air around them. "The coordinates are confirmed. Transfer the payment." The words were clear, cold, unmistakable. Jack knew that voice. It belonged to Eli Harper. His throat tightened. The same voice that had once whispered jokes into a comms headset now sounded like a death sentence. Claire pressed a fist to her mouth, eyes glistening. My sister's husband died because of him, she said, her voice breaking. And yours too. Jack's jaw clenched, the weight of 10 years of guilt pressed down like the ceiling itself. He had buried the memory of his team, their laughter, their blood, their last screams, and tried to live as if the war had ended. But it hadn't. It had just changed shape. Why didn't you go to the police? He asked quietly. Claire laughed bitterly. The police? Harper Defense funds half their equipment. He's untouchable. Jack stared at the flickering glow of the fireplace, the shadows twisting across the walls. He thought of Eli's calm face under the hospital lights, that same self-assured control he'd seen in the desert. He killed them all, Jack whispered, more to himself than to her, and made himself a hero doing it. He reached for the drive, weighing it in his palm. This is enough to bury him. Claire's eyes darkened. Only if we survive long enough to use it. Thunder rolled outside. Thor stood suddenly, ears erect, a low growl building in his throat. Jack turned off the flashlight. Through the thin curtains, a glow of headlights cut through the trees, 2 beams, moving fast. Claire's face went pale. He found us, she breathed. Jack grabbed the drive and shoved it into his jacket pocket. Back door, he ordered. Claire moved to protest, but the first vehicle stopped outside, doors slamming. Men's voices, low, professional, organized. Too late, Jack muttered. He motioned for Thor to guard the rear as he took position by the window. 3 figures emerged from the SUV, dark raincoats glistening under the storm. One carried a rifle with a mounted light, another scanned the cabin with a flashlight. The third stood taller, umbrella in hand, perfectly composed amid the chaos. Even from the distance, Jack recognized that stillness. Lucas Hart, Eli Harper, had come himself. The man's profile was sharper now, his hair shorter, his movements deliberate. He spoke into a radio, his tone calm, commanding. The last time Jack had seen that face, it had been smeared with ash and dust under desert sun. Now it gleamed under the rain like a mask carved from steel. Jack's pulse hammered. He's here for the drive, Claire whispered. He won't leave witnesses. Jack nodded, eyes fixed on the figures outside. Then we don't give him any. He grabbed Claire's hand, guiding her toward the back exit. The sound of footsteps on gravel grew louder. Thor snarled softly, muscles coiled. Jack whispered, Go now. They slipped through the back door into the forest, the downpour swallowing their tracks. Behind them, the cabin door burst open, flashlights slicing through. The darkness, voices shouted orders, boots pounding the floor. Jack pulled Claire down behind a fallen tree as gunfire cracked through the storm. Thor lunged out, barking furiously to draw attention, zigzagging between trunks. One of the gunmen fired toward the sound, missing by inches. Jack returned a single shot, forcing them to take cover. Keep moving, he hissed. They ran through the woods, slipping in mud, branches whipping their faces. The sound of engines starting again told him Eli's men weren't giving up. When they reached the creek, the current roared higher than before, swollen by rain. Jack pointed across. We cross here. They can't follow with vehicles. Claire hesitated only a second before plunging in, the icy water biting at her legs. Thor bounded ahead, leading the way. They climbed the opposite bank, soaked, gasping. Behind them, flashlights flickered among the trees, growing distant. Jack turned back once, the glow of the cabin visible through the pines, then a flash of orange. Flames rose, bright against the black night. Eli's men were burning it. Claire stared, eyes wide with disbelief. He's destroying everything. Jack's voice was grim. Everything but us. They stood in silence as the fire devoured the last piece of safety they had left, until the wind carried the smoke toward the sky and the rain finally began to drown it. The rain had stopped, but the air still shimmered with heat and smoke from the burning cabin behind them. The forest groaned under the orange glow, embers falling like dying fireflies through the mist. Jack Porter half-dragged, half-carried Claire through the slick undergrowth, her breath shallow and quick. She was trembling, one sleeve torn and darkened with blood where a splinter had grazed her arm. Thor limped beside them, mud clinging to his fur, his flank streaked with soot. The fire reflected in his eyes, sharp and alive, as if he understood that everything they'd uncovered was now turning to ash. Jack's lungs burned, every step jarring the old wound in his leg. The smell of gasoline filled the air. Eli's men had set the blaze deliberately. Behind them, faint shouts echoed through the trees, the clipped rhythm of trained professionals sweeping the area. Claire stumbled, falling to her knees. Jack knelt beside her, steadying her shoulders. "We can't stop," he whispered. "Not yet." Her eyes, fever bright with exhaustion, met his. "He took it," she gasped. "The drive. He took everything." Jack glanced back at the inferno devouring the cabin. "If he stole it," he said quietly, "it means he still needs it. That gives us a chance." They pressed on until the forest thinned and the outline of the old rail yard emerged through the haze. The yard had been abandoned for decades, a maze of rusted containers, cranes left to rot, and weeds that had swallowed the tracks. It was the kind of place no one looked at twice. Jack led Claire toward a small warehouse whose roof had half collapsed. Inside, the air was cold, metallic, and smelled faintly of oil. He found an old cot against the wall and guided her onto it. Thor circled once before lying near the door, still on alert despite his injury. The silence inside the warehouse was almost fragile, as if even the walls were afraid to echo. Claire leaned back against the cot, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the holes in the roof. "He'll erase everything," she murmured. "The files, the names, even me. That's what he does. He cleans his own mess." Jack knelt, checking the wound on her arm. "You're not part of his mess," he said, tearing a strip from his sleeve to wrap it. "You're what's left of his conscience." She let out a bitter laugh that quickly turned into a sob. "You really think he has one?" Jack didn't answer. He focused on tying the cloth, his hands steady though his mind was anything but. When he finished, he sank against the wall, his gaze distant. He thought of the voice on the recorder, the one that had haunted him for years. "The coordinates are confirmed. Transfer the payment." The line replayed in his mind like a curse. He rubbed his temple. "He knew they'd all die," Jack whispered. "He set it up." Claire turned to him slowly. "And you lived," she said softly. "Maybe that's why he came back for Dusud. You to make sure there aren't any ghosts left." Thor stirred, head lifting, ears twitching toward the entrance. Jack froze. A faint crunch of gravel, too careful to be the wind. He motioned for silence. The sound grew nearer, soft, deliberate steps. Jack drew his pistol, the cold metal grounding him. The beam of a flashlight swept across the wall, followed by a low, raspy voice. "Don't shoot. I'm here to help." A figure stepped into the light. A man in his late 30s, tall but gaunt, with hollow cheeks and dark stubble shadowing his jaw. His jacket was wet and torn, his hands raised in surrender. His hair, once dark, was streaked with early gray, and his eyes, tired, vigilant, rimmed with sleeplessness, told stories of fear and guilt. "Who are you?" Jack demanded, not lowering the gun. The man swallowed hard. "Name's Marcus Reed. I worked for Harper Defense." Jack's grip tightened. "You're one of his men." Marcus shook his head. "Was. I'm not anymore." He stepped forward slightly, his voice trembling, but steady enough to hold weight. "I know what's on that drive. I know what he's done. I have copies. Everything." Claire sat up, disbelief flickering across her face. "Copies? How?" Marcus looked at her, recognition dawning. "You're Dawson, the journalist. You were getting close to exposing him, weren't you?" She hesitated, then nodded. Marcus gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "You scared him more than you think." Jack lowered the pistol an inch, but didn't holster it. "Why are you here?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "Because I can't run anymore. He's got my family. My wife, my daughter. They're being held in a safe house near the docks. He told me if I stayed quiet, they'd live. But now that the cabin's gone, he'll come for me too. I need your help. I'll give you everything I have. Names, transactions, locations, if you promise to get them out." His words tumbled out between ragged breaths. The desperation in his voice was raw, unfiltered, the sound of a man clinging to what little he had left. Claire's eyes softened. "How old is your daughter?" Marcus looked away, swallowing hard. 8. She likes to paint. She doesn't know what I've done. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed smaller, the weight of regret pulling at his shoulders. Jack studied him, the trembling hands, the nervous glances toward the door. Everything about the man screamed truth, not performance, but truth didn't mean safety. "If this is a trap," Jack warned, "I'll bury you where you stand." Marcus nodded. "Fair." He reached into his jacket slowly and pulled out a small waterproof pouch, setting it on the floor between them. "One of the backup drives. Not everything, but enough to prove I'm not lying." Jack picked it up carefully. The label read, Project Meridian. He looked at Claire. "This name mean anything to you?" She frowned. "It was a code name in the files. I thought it was a weapons program." Marcus shook his head. "Not weapons, people. He's been selling security personnel to off-the-book buyers. Mercenaries, smugglers, private wars no one admits exist." His voice cracked. "And Yemen? That was just the beginning." The rain started again, drumming softly against the roof. Jack felt the old rage rising, that familiar heat he'd buried for years. "We'll get your family," he said finally. "But first, we find where he's keeping them." Marcus nodded, a flicker of hope crossing his haunted eyes. "There's a warehouse at the docks, Pier 9. He keeps all his shipments there. It's heavily guarded, but I can get you in." Jack turned to Claire. "You trust him?" She hesitated. "No, but I believe his fear." Jack holstered his weapon, the decision made. "Then we move before dawn." Thor gave a soft grunt of agreement, stretching beside the door. Outside, the forest hissed with rain and smoke, and far off, thunder rolled again, not from the sky this time, but from the engines of men already hunting them. The rain had thinned to a steady drizzle, whispering against the rusted roof of the warehouse. Jack Porter sat near the doorway, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside while the flickering flame of an oil lamp cast long shadows across the walls. Beside him, Thor lay curled, the dog's flank rising and falling slowly as he dozed in uneasy rest. The scent of damp metal and motor oil filled the air, mixing with the faint, acrid bite of smoke still clinging to their clothes from the fire at Silver Creek. Across from Jack, Marcus Reed crouched on a crate, staring into nothing. His fingers worried the edges of a small waterproof pouch, the same one that contained the backup drive. In the dim light, Marcus looked older than his years. The beard along his jaw was uneven, silver creeping through the black. His face was drawn, sharp from hunger and sleeplessness, but it was his eyes that told the story, gray, hollow, and hunted. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and still owed too much more. Claire sat nearby, wrapped in Jack's jacket. The fabric dwarfed her, but she didn't complain. She had washed the blood from her arm at a broken sink, and now she traced the rim of a chipped mug without drinking. Her mind seemed far away, trapped somewhere between exhaustion and fear. Every so often she glanced at Marcus, her expression torn between suspicion and pity. Finally, she broke the silence. "You said you worked for him, for Harper Defense. What exactly did you do?" Marcus didn't look up. "I ran logistics, communications between the offshore contracts and domestic suppliers." He exhaled slowly, a sound halfway between a sigh and a confession. "On paper, I coordinated supply chains. In truth, I helped move people. Contractors, soldiers of fortune, refugees who didn't even know they'd been sold." Jack frowned. "Sold?" Marcus nodded. "To whoever paid, private wars, rebel factions, corporations wanting security in unstable regions. Harper Defense handled the paperwork, licenses, transportation, disappearances. I thought I was just following orders. But after Yemen, after the coordinates leak, I started seeing the patterns. People who asked too many questions vanished, data scrubbed, families paid to stay silent. When I realized the ambush wasn't an accident, I tried to back out." He looked at his hands, shaking slightly. "That's when he took my family." Claire's voice softened, but there was iron in it. "He's keeping them at the docks?" Marcus nodded. "Pier 9, old shipping warehouse. There's a lower level under the containers, converted into a holding space. Not just my family, I think. Others too. People they use as leverage, witnesses, employees who tried to talk. He looked up at Jack finally. You said you'd help me get them out. I'll hold you to that. Jack didn't flinch. You get me to that warehouse, and I'll make sure no one touches your wife or daughter again, but you're coming with me. If this is a setup, it's not, Marcus cut in quickly. If it were, you'd already be dead. His tone wasn't arrogant, just grimly factual. Jack studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, we move before dawn. Tell me everything about the layout. Marcus reached into his bag and pulled out a crumpled map of the dockyards, its corners stained and folded soft. The main entrance faces the waterfront, he said, tracing the lines with a dirty fingernail. 2 guards there, another at the security gate near the access road. Inside, they use rotating patrols, 3 men, maybe 4. The lower level is accessible through a freight elevator that's disguised as a storage lift. That's where they keep the hostages. You'll need a key card, and I can get us one. He hesitated before adding, but there's a catch. The server holding the tracking data for every shipment, it's down there too. If we can copy that, you'll have everything you need to expose Harper. Names, routes, payments, all of it. Claire leaned forward. That could bring him down completely. Marcus shook his head. Or it could get us all killed. Depends who finds us first. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the distant ocean. Jack rubbed his hands together, thinking. Then we go in quiet, he said. No gunfire unless necessary. Claire stays in the truck with Thor until we've secured the family. Claire's eyes flashed. You really think I'm sitting this out? You're not trained for what's waiting in there, Jack replied, tone even but firm. And I've already pulled you out of 1 death trap tonight. You might need someone who knows how to pull data from a locked server, she countered. Or did you forget who used to write for Wired before I went into investigative journalism? Jack opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had to admit she had a point. Fine, he said. But you follow my lead. No heroics. Marcus gave a short laugh that sounded more like disbelief. We're planning a raid on a private military contractor with 3 people and a dog. Heroics aren't optional. Jack ignored the comment and stood, stretching his back. Get some rest. We move in 4 hours. Claire tried to lie down, but sleep never came. Her thoughts churned with images. The burning cabin, Eli's cold eyes, the sound of the recorder playing his voice. She turned toward Marcus, who sat staring at a photo he had pulled from his wallet. A woman with long auburn hair and a small girl with dimples, smiling in front of a sunflower field. They're beautiful, she said softly. He looked up, startled, then nodded. Anna and Lily, he murmured. They're why I can't stop running. Harper told me once, every man's loyalty can be bought. You just have to know the currency. For me, it was them. His voice cracked and he looked away. I used to think he was brilliant. Now I just think he's empty. Jack watched them from the doorway, arms crossed. He saw a reflection of himself in Marcus, the same haunted look of someone who'd lost too much and kept going anyway. He didn't trust him fully, but he understood him. They were men cut from the same broken cloth. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the holes in the roof, Jack gathered their weapons, 2 pistols, a shotgun with only 4 shells, and a knife. Not much, but it would have to do. He checked the map one last time. We'll take the back access road, he said. Less patrols, more cover. Marcus, you lead. Claire, stay behind me. Thor, watch the rear. The dog wagged his tail once, ready. The rain had stopped, leaving the world hushed and cold. Before they left, Marcus paused by the oil lamp, his shadow long against the wall. You ever wonder, he said quietly, what we'll look like if we survive this? Jack gave him a thin, humorless smile. Like men who finally did one thing right. Then he blew out the lamp, and the 3 of them slipped into the dawn, moving toward the docks where truth and danger waited in equal measure. The wind had teeth by the time they reached Pier 9. Neon signs from a shuttered seafood market blinked like broken warnings. Rain slashed across the cracked asphalt in sheets that stung the face. The dock smelled of diesel, salt, and old iron. Smells that fit easily into Jack Porter's memory because they were the same smells from other nights he'd learned to be alive. He parked the truck in a shadowed lot 2 blocks away, and they moved on foot, jackets pulled up, heads down against the gale. Thor padded beside Jack, paws sure on the slick surface, muzzle streaked with mud from the night's running. Claire walked with a laptop case slung over her shoulder. In daylight, she looked younger and harder at once. Shoulders narrow, hair cut into a blunt bob now, damp and plastered to her skull, eyes that had learned to read fear and spreadsheets with equal speed. Marcus walked ahead with a cautious swagger, voice low when he pointed out guards, containers, and the cracked chain-link fence they would breach. He kept glancing to the dark water as if afraid to see his family appear as a silhouette at the pier edge. They slipped through the perimeter, where rust met rot, and found a maintenance gap Marcus knew would be unmonitored for minutes at a time. The dockyard's heart thudded with generators and distant radios. Jack's breathing was even and controlled. There was a long list of things in him sharper than pain: discipline, memory, a soldier's habit of measuring risk like a man checking gear. Claire's hands moved quickly now, fingers dancing across the laptop pad as she scanned wireless frequencies for cameras and patrol comms. Thor's ears tilted toward squeaks in the dark and the soft shuffle of boots. The dog's focus was a living instrument Jack had learned to read better than any map. Marcus produced the key card he'd promised, sweaty, smudged with oil, a single stolen currency against a machine of power, and they slipped inside the warehouse through a service door masked by a tarp. The lower level smelled of mold and old sweat. Fluorescent lights hummed above long rows of stacked crates. At the far end, where the air thinned and the concrete floor sloped toward an old loading ramp, 2 figures sat beneath a pallet of plywood. Women, hands bound, faces pale but alive. One was Anna Reed, Marcus's wife, mid-30s, auburn hair pulled into a messy bun, skin freckled from summers long ago, eyes rimmed red but fierce in the way of mothers forced to be brave. The other was Lily, an 8-year-old with round cheeks and a splinter of a tooth missing when she smiled. She clutched a small stuffed rabbit, ink smudges on its ear where she'd tried to draw courage. Seeing them staggered Marcus in a way the photo had not. The hollowed man from the warehouse folded with a wet sob and then gathered himself like someone remembering how to breathe. Thor strained for a whine, and Jack felt the axis of the night change. This was no longer only about proof. It was about getting those 2 out alive. They were not alone. The low hum of a handheld radio warned Jack before a silhouette filled the stairwell, a guard with the flat, practiced face of someone who understood their role and not its morality. He was broad-shouldered, late 30s, a crop of stubble along his chin, eyes like stones. Jack's hand moved before his mind finished thinking. A suppressed round from the shotgun took the guard's knee, and he doubled over with a single bark. Thor leapt, a living wedge between the captor and his prey, shredding the man's balance while Claire hauled at the ropes, cutting Anna's wrists with a pocket knife. For heartbeats, the warehouse was a flurry of movement. Bootsteps, the metallic clack of a radio, Claire's quick, efficient fingers as she worked, and the small, astonishing calm in Jack's chest when his muscle memory took over. Jack barked orders like the voice of a man used to leading in storms and skirmishes. Marcus moved to cradle Lily, whispering apologies into her hair. A colder, more precise sound announced the arrival of more men up the ramp. Flashlights cut wide across crates, and for a second metallic reflections looked like stars falling. That cut through to a deeper recognition. Eli Harper did not send men when he wanted a body. He came when he wanted to send a lesson. Eli stepped into the light then, coat collars wet and hair plastered, face sharper than Jack remembered, but with the same cruel, patient tilt to the mouth. He stood calm as a man at prayer and spoke without raising his voice. "Touch them and you die, Jack." There was a mock tenderness in the way he said it, as if he offered the only possible mercy left in a world he controlled. Eli was in his 40s now, jawline like chiseled rock, eyes a cold gray capable of measuring value in people. He wore the arrogance of a man who'd turned betrayal into capital. Jack's reply was simple, even as thunder rolled behind Eli's words. "Then I die doing the right thing." The standoff fractured into action. Eli's men moved with brutal efficiency, but they were not soldiers of a nation. They were hired certainty, and for all their discipline, they lacked the edge of someone with nothing left to lose. Gunfire stuttered. Claire, with an instinct born of years behind screens and in dangerous alleys, dragged Anna and Lily behind an upended pallet and sprinted for the side exit Marcus had scouted. Jack advanced toward Eli, each step a decision, each breath measured. He thought of the recorder, of coordinates sold like a commodity, of brothers lost to greed. The two men met under the glare of emergency lights and the roar of wind. Eli moved like a man who had rehearsed his control. Jack moved like a man who had nothing left to lose. A spark, an accident, or a deliberate strike found a line of fuel in a stack of crates, and the warehouse became a furnace. Heat hit them like a wall. Someone's curse turned to a scream as flame licked the plywood. For a second, the world reduced to orange and noise. Jack grabbed at Eli, wrestling him back from firing another shot, but a secondary explosion shuddered the rafters. Thor's bark turned into a sound of a stripped panic. Jack lunged for Lily as smoke clawed the beam of his headlamp. Thor, teeth white in the smoke, caught Jack by his jacket and dragged, an animal instinct, a pure refusal to lose the man he loved. They tumbled through a curtain of heat and ash out into the raw rain, coughing and burning. Claire hauled Anna and Lily free, coughing, while Marcus collapsed beside them, his body shaking with relief and terror. The first roar of police sirens arrived like a miracle. Sheriff Ben Carter's cruiser rolled up with lights cutting the storm. Carter was a broad-shouldered man, hair cut close, face marked with a life of small-town justice and old loyalty to those he'd served with. He led officers with methodical calm into the chaos. A police helicopter's searchlight swung wide and painted the sky. Eli Harper, coughing and blinking against the lights, found himself surrounded by men with badges and notched collars. The arrogance left his face like a mask slipping. Handcuffs clicked in the dark. Marcus fell to his knees and gathered Anna and Lily in a wet embrace that smelled of diesel and rain and the small, simple absolution of reunion. Thor licked Jack's face until he laughed through tears and smoke. In the distance, the warehouse burned, a black tooth of night swallowed slowly by rain. And for the first time since the river under the bridge, Jack felt the raw weight of some wrong begin to shift. The courthouse in downtown Everett stood gray and solemn under a low December sky. Frost glazed the steps and the flag above barely stirred. Inside, the air was heavy with quiet, the kind that follows truth finally being spoken aloud. Jack Porter sat at the back of the courtroom beside Claire Dawson and Marcus Reed, his hands folded, his jaw tight but calm. Thor lay at his feet, his fur clean now but his left ear notched from the night at the docks, a scar he carried like a badge. The judge's gavel struck once, the sound sharp and final. "Eli Harper," the voice declared, "you are found guilty on all counts: espionage, conspiracy, and treason against the United States." Eli didn't flinch. He stood in the defendant's box with the same precision he once carried into briefings and boardrooms. His once perfect suit hung loose now, his hair longer, shot with silver. But the eyes, those cold gray eyes, were unchanged. He looked at Jack as if across a battlefield neither had truly left. For a moment, silence stretched between them like a thread. Then Eli smiled, the faint, broken smile of a man who'd gambled with loyalty and lost. "We were the same once," he said quietly. Jack didn't answer. The marshal led Eli away, shackles clinking, his figure disappearing down the long corridor that smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. When it was over, the courthouse emptied slowly. Outside, the morning light had sharpened. Claire zipped her coat and turned to Jack. Her hair caught the pale sun, strands of chestnut turning copper for an instant. "You okay?" she asked. He gave a small nod. "Justice never feels like victory," he said. "It just feels quieter." Marcus joined them, looking younger now that the weight had shifted off his shoulders. He wore a clean shirt and jacket borrowed from the precinct, still wrinkled, but whole. "The Bureau's clearing my name," he said, almost shyly. "They're putting my family in witness protection for a while, until the trial papers settle." He hesitated, then pulled a folded photo from his pocket. "Anna and Lily wanted you both to have this." In it, Sunlight spilled over a small farmhouse. Anna in a yellow sweater, Lily laughing mid-spin, the dog they'd adopted running circles around her. Jack held the photo a long moment before sliding it carefully into his jacket. They walked together toward the parking lot. The air smelled of sea salt and car exhaust, and the sound of distant gulls broke through the traffic. Claire's phone buzzed, and she smiled faintly at the message. "It's my editor," she said. "They're publishing the story tonight." "You finished it?" Jack asked. "Yeah," she said softly. "It's called The Bridge Beneath the Storm, What One Man Refused to Forget. It's about you." Jack gave a quiet, almost embarrassed laugh. "Then make sure you spell my name wrong," he said. "I'm not great with attention." She smirked. Too late. Weeks passed. Snow arrived in thin sheets across the harbor town, softening the edges of the world. Jack settled into his small house near the water, the same one that had stood quiet for years before Thor came scratching at its door. He spent mornings fixing old fishing boats and afternoons walking the dog along the shoreline. The limp in his leg had worsened with the cold, but he welcomed the pain. It reminded him he was still here, still moving forward. Thor had healed too, though his fur never quite lost the smoky tint from the fire. The dog followed Jack everywhere, loyal as breath, eyes always searching the horizon as if expecting one more mission. One evening, Jack found a letter in his mailbox. No return address, just a simple envelope sealed with official wax. Inside was a medal, dull bronze with a ribbon frayed at the edges. "Service restored," the inscription read. His record had been cleared, the operation in Yemen, once erased and buried, now listed as compromised by internal treason, survivors exonerated. Jack set the medal on the shelf beside an old photograph. 6 young men in desert fatigues, smiling under a sky they didn't yet know would turn red. He touched the edge of the frame and whispered the names aloud, a ritual of memory rather than mourning. The next morning, Claire appeared at his door. She wore a gray wool coat and carried 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the cold. Her cheeks were flushed from the wind. "I figured you wouldn't come to the city," she said, handing him a cup. "So I came to you." They walked to the bridge together, the same bridge where the story had begun months earlier. The river ran slower now, carrying chunks of ice that caught the light. Jack leaned on the railing, the metal cold under his hands. Thor lay at his feet, tail sweeping lazily. "You ever think about that night?" Claire asked quietly. "Every day," Jack replied. "But it doesn't hurt anymore." She turned to him, eyes soft. "After everything, do you regret saving me?" Jack watched the horizon, where sunlight broke through the fog like a slow confession. "No," he said. "Saving you reminded me there's still something worth saving in this world." Claire smiled, small and real. The wind lifted her hair as she looked out across the water. "You think the storm's finally over?" she asked. Jack glanced down at Thor, whose eyes tracked a distant bird. "No," he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth, "but I think we finally learned how to live in it." As they stood there, the first true light of dawn spilled across the river, turning the surface to molten gold. Jack straightened, his shoulders easing back, the years of guilt and silence falling away like old armor. The bridge gleamed faintly beneath their feet, steel, scarred but unbroken. Thor lifted his head, ears pricking at something unseen, then lay back down, content. The town stirred awake behind them, boats, creaking, gulls crying, the sound of life returning. And for the first time in a long while, Jack Porter didn't feel like a ghost in someone else's war. He felt like a man standing where he was meant to be. When the smoke clears and the storms fade, what remains isn't luck, it's grace, the kind that pulls a broken man from the ashes and reminds him he was never fighting alone. Every breath, every sunrise, every loyal heartbeat beside us is proof that God still works through the ordinary, through courage, forgiveness, and love that refuses to die. Jack's journey isn't fiction. It's a mirror for anyone who's ever carried guilt, loss, or silence too long. So if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember hope still lives. Tell us where you're watching from. Leave a prayer in the comments and subscribe for more stories that honor faith, redemption, and the unseen miracles that carry us home. May God bless and keep you through your own storm.